Good evening and welcome. I'm John Carr. I'm the founder of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life here at Georgetown University in Washington. On behalf of our director, Kim Daniels, and our initiative team, I'm very happy to welcome you to this live stream dialogue. Our topic is Faith in the Faithful in the 2004 election. What happened, why, and what now? We're delighted more than 3,250 people have registered to listen in. If you want to share your thoughts on social media, use the hashtag GUFaith post-election 24. And by tagging the initiative at GUCST Public Life, I think that'll show up on the screen. And we'll have some questions and answers after our first set of conversations with the leaders who are with us tonight. And to share a question, follow the prompts on the screen. This dialogue is being recorded and will be posted on our website and social challenge for later viewing. This dialogue is part of an ongoing distinctive effort of our initiative to focus on faith in the faithful in U.S. politics. In the first 10, 11 years we've been around, we've probably done 20 of these. This, I think, is going to be one of the most interesting. This fall, we did 4 sessions. We did a preview. We did a couple sessions for young people and Latino leaders. But now we're doing 2 sessions after the election. Tonight is going to focus on faith in the faithful, what happened and why, really focus on the specifics. And then on December 10th, we're having an in-person dialogue at Georgetown on what do we do now with David Brooks from the New York Times, president of Holy Cross, Carrie Robinson from Catholic Charities USA, and Sister Teresa Maya of CHA. So tonight we're focusing on what happened and why, how religious values, voters, and communities shaped the election and affected the outcome. Think back a week ago. We were sitting, waiting, watching to see who would lead our nation. Well, now we know. President Trump is going back to the White House. The Republicans will control Congress, and they'll have a narrow majority, it looks like, in the House. The Republicans have controlled the Senate. What we don't know and haven't talked about much is how religious values and voters shape that outcome, and how the appeals of candidates and parties to people's values and deepest convictions made a difference. Oftentimes, the role of religion, the role of values is neglected or oversimplified. Tonight, we bring together 4 respected reporters and analysts to share their data, their reporting, and their analysis on the role of faith in the faithful in last Tuesday's election. Ryan Burge is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Eastern Illinois University, and he has become one of the most respected experts and analysts on religion and politics. If you don't see his Substack called Graphs on Religion, you should. He is the author of The Nones, Nones, Where They Come From, Where They're Going, and 20 Myths on Religion and Politics. Father Tom Rees is a Jesuit priest, a senior analyst at Religion News Service, former editor of America, and author of numerous books on the organization of the Catholic Church. My favorite title, Tom, is Flock of Shepherds, which is a description of the U.S. Catholic bishops. He is a doctorate in political science, and he served as chair and member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Sabrina Rodriguez is a national politics reporter for the Washington Post, reporting on the changing U.S. electorate, spent a lot of time in battleground states, and she is one of the most thoughtful and informed journalists on Latinos in U.S. politics. She previously covered national politics, immigration, and trade at Politico. She has been a regular participant in our dialogues, and we thank her both for her outstanding journalism and for her participation. And Judy Woodruff is a senior correspondent and, of course, the former anchor and managing editor of the PBS NewsHour. when she left the NewsHour, she started this remarkable series called America at the Crossroads. And in that effort, she talked to hundreds of voters and explored what divided and united Americans. She's won countless awards for her coverage of the White House, U.S. politics, and her leadership of the NewsHour. So thank you all for being with us. Let's start the conversation. And I have one question for all of you. It's predictable, but useful. What do you think was the most important or surprising thing about last Tuesday's elections, especially as it relates to faith in the faithful or the values that you think drove the outcome? Let me start with you, Judy.
Well, John, first of all, I'm so glad to be joining you and to be joining Tom and Sabrina and Ryan. Can't wait to hear what they have to say and to hear their analysis of the results of the election. It's hard to say what's most surprising. We're still sifting through the results as they've come to us in what they call exit polls, interviews with voters after they went to the polls. I would say overall the magnitude of former President Trump's win, the fact that he not only swept all the swing states, but that he did much better than I think many had forecast he would, even in the blue states in New York and California, places across the country. The magnitude of his win, I think, is something that we are still looking at, trying to understand. To me, that is a piece of the election result that we can spend a lot of time talking about. With regard to faith, I think I would say the results were not so surprising. And I turn to the exit polls here and I look at 76% of Americans who say they identify with a particular faith. The big majority voted for Donald Trump. And you all have seen these numbers, Protestant or other Christian. They make up 42% of the electorate. 63% of them voted for former President Trump. And among those who identify as white, born again, evangelical Christian, they're 22% of the electorate. 82% of them voted for Donald Trump. And at the other end of the spectrum, people who Ryan Burge knows so well, the nones, the people who say they don't have any religious affiliation, that was the one group that Kamala Harris won. They make up, again, about a quarter of the electorate. She won 71% of them. So I think that tells a story. It's not the whole story, but it does give us some foundation for beginning to try to understand what happened.
Thank you, Judy. Ryan, you've been studying this a long time. What do you think was most important or what surprised you?
Yeah, so I've been spending the last couple of days doing an autopsy of states that had abortion referendum or initiative on the ballot, which are 10 states, and then looking at those county level abortion votes versus the Trump vote. And this is something I wrote about in 20 Myths over 3 years ago. I've said for a long time, I don't think abortion is as important to people, even evangelicals and Catholics, as everyone makes it out to be. And these results just reaffirm my belief, because you can see that even, in places that love Donald Trump, where he got between 50 and 65% of the vote, over half those people voted for abortion access. So there were a whole lot of people who went to the polls last week and voted for Donald Trump and for either enshrining abortion access or expanding abortion access in their state. Economics matters more than anything else in times like this. It's almost like a luxury. When everything's going well, we can care about things like the death penalty and the environment and abortion and all the values voters things. What I also think is fascinating is that Trump ran in 2016 about he was going to overturn Roe, and he did through his Supreme Court appointees, and then he tacked back to the middle, and it actually got him more votes in 2024. So he ran as a pro-life candidate, and now he kind of ran as a moderate, kind of pragmatic person on abortion, and it actually probably won him more votes in 2024. So to me, there are very few voters that make abortion this one and done issue. They're single issue voters. And I think if anything, 2024 convinced me that the pro-life movement is probably weaker today than it was at any point in the last 50 years.
Yeah. That seems to be pretty clear from the data. The other thing is an abortion-focused campaign on the left isn't very persuasive either. They built their campaign around that and thought it would make a huge difference. And the data shows that it didn't really in some places. Tom, what surprised you? What do you think was most important?
Well, I agree with everything that people have already said. The magnitude of Trump's victory, the fact that he swept every swing state, I think surprised us. The fact that Latinos voted more for Trump this year than they did in previous elections, more for Republicans, that's quite significant. And the fact that women didn't give the bounce to Harris that she needed in order to win the election, showing what you just said, that making the election all about abortion didn't work. People went to the polls and voted for being pro-choice, and then turned around and voted for Trump. Getting them to vote, women to vote, didn't necessarily mean that Harris was going to win the election. I guess the final thing that surprised me is that we were surprised. If we had looked at the fundamentals and stuck to that, it's the economy, stupid. We would have predicted what happened. This was not a good year for an incumbent vice president or president. With the polls, the favorability of Biden so bad, with the inflation, the economy being the issue, and the Democrats not having anything to say about the economy, all of these things made it a bad day for the Democrats.
Yeah. Sabrina, Tom covered a number of things there. The economy, which you have covered a lot, Latinos, which you are a preeminent reporter. What surprised you? What was the most important?
Well, I think first of all, I'm so glad we're doing this conversation. Every time I'm now having these debriefs about the election, I'm calling them versions of therapy sessions where we all get to unpack, what happened and where we were surprised or not. And I think, I don't know how much of a surprise, but for me, my focus has been just on the multitudes that people contain. I think leading up to the election, what Democrats were betting on in part was that people would look at Donald Trump, the person, and not be willing to vote for him. That because of his personality, the rhetoric he uses, some of the, more far-right policies or perspectives he's embraced, that people would be alarmed. They focused a lot on the comments about whether or not, the conversation around whether or not he was a fascist, and, a lot of focus on January 6th and what a threat he was to democracy. And I think that, we saw Democrats really leaning on that with this belief that Americans at the end of the day would not vote for someone like Donald Trump, or someone who that they characterize the way that they characterize Donald Trump to be. But what we saw was, and as everyone has kind of talked about, was ultimately it didn't matter in the face of people feeling tremendous economic anxiety. It didn't matter in the face of people being really concerned about immigration and about the number of migrants that have come in the last 4 years. I've talked to countless voters who did vote for Donald Trump and also told me they did not like Donald Trump. So it's not just off of exit polls. It's, you go out and you talk to voters and you hear, people that were insulted by the comment about, Puerto Rico being an island of garbage that was mentioned at a Madison Square Garden Trump rally. And I met so many Puerto Ricans who told me how insulted they felt, how mad they were about the comment, and they still went to vote for Donald Trump because they thought he was best for the economy and on the issue of immigration. So I think, as we unpack this election, I think we're going to find more and more just how complicated people are, how simple and complicated at the end of the day, I think the American electorate is.
So surprise was the magnitude, surprised that we weren't surprised, not surprised that we're really complicated voters. And let me come back to each of you for a more extended conversation. And I want to start with you, Judy. Judy, when you left the anchor position at the NewsHour, you had every right to sort of go home, put up your feet, cheer for Duke basketball, and sort of watch the world go by. And
Georgetown, what about
yeah, yeah, well, we're for that, although that's hard work right now. We hope it's getting better. But you did something remarkable. You're a person that has interviewed every president, every world leader, all the big shots. And you decided to go into the country and talk to voters, talk to a lot of voters for a long time. This remarkable series, America at the Crossroads. If you haven't seen it, you need to see it. And there's all this commentary after the election where all these people who didn't see it coming are now telling us it was inevitable. Your post-election episode didn't interview the pundits and the pollsters. You just talked to voters after the election. What did you hear from the voters that can help us understand the outcome? What are the values? What are the issues, the fears and the hopes that shape the choices that the voters made?
Well, you're right. I just consider it a privilege actually to be able to go around the country and talk to voters everywhere in as many places as we can go to. In fact, we're going to continue it for another year. We're going to try to look at what solutions there might be out there for bringing people together, but just to try to achieve a deeper understanding of what's going on. But in terms of why people voted the way they did, I think it became pretty clear early on that people were frustrated with the current administration in a number of ways, but principally around the economy. And you could say the handwriting was on the wall, the pandemic, what led to the supply chain, higher prices, the whole debate over the vaccine, over COVID. And while COVID is receded into the background, people still remember a lot of what happened there. And certainly the economy, high prices, even though the inflation rate has come down, people still are feeling those high prices. We've been hearing that for well over a year now. I'll never forget the couple I interviewed in Steubenville, Ohio. We went to this community, it used to be a thriving steel town. Now it is a place that's frankly struggling. But many people still live there, still hold jobs. At the local food bank, the line was around the block. People in their cars, standing in line, waiting to get food. We interviewed one couple in particular. The husband works full-time in construction. The wife stays home to take care of two children. And she said, we just can't afford what we used to be able to afford. She said things were less under President Trump, which was true, and still is true, because we know prices go up, they don't go down. And she said, we believe that gas, housing, bread, milk, it's all going to be less if President Trump returns. Now, we'll wait to see whether what they find from his administration once he becomes president again, whether people truly expect him to deliver lower prices. But I would say, we've heard it over and over again. I just don't think we can emphasize enough how much working people, were people who live paycheck to paycheck, and people who don't have a big cushion. They were driven by the economy. We also heard people bring up immigration, brought up people bringing up how much they thought the Democratic Party agenda was too identity focused, and they put that in different words. Some of them spoke about they didn't like the emphasis on transgender. Some of this was reflecting the television ads they were seeing. As we know, the Republicans spent $100 million to run ads about Kamala Harris's statements about supporting transgender individuals when she was in California. So there were a number of things, but it does come down, I think, to the economy and to a feeling that this administration wasn't connecting, wasn't hearing them. And it's not to say Kamala Harris didn't get a lot of votes. She got 66, 67 million votes, but he got the majority. And I think that's what drove it.
One of the fascinating things about American at the Crossroads was you were looking for what divides us and what unites us. What what drives polarization and what could bring us together? It's great to hear you're going to keep the show going and focus on maybe some things that could bring us together. But what did you learn from voters about what divides us and what conceivably might bring us together?
Well, you may not like this answer, but I would say everything contributes to dividing us. Where we grew up, the family we grew up in, our economic circumstances, where we live in the country right now, what our education level is, faith, certainly to some extent, but all those basics that make up who we are, where we came from, how we developed our beliefs. And again, I think the economy has a lot to do with it, but it's not everything. Some people will tell you, who are very comfortable, who are living very comfortable lives, but who just really like Donald Trump's message that we need a tough leader. Some people are very clear that they didn't think a woman, and specifically with regard to the choices in this election, that a woman was the right choice to lead the country at a time when the world is facing as many challenges as it is. And there were a number of other reasons, but the reasons we are divided as a people are complex. And that's why I would say that fixing this or bringing us closer together is not an easy thing. And there's no sort of magic dust that we can sort of sprinkle on everybody that's going to make us closer together. What I think realistically we ought to be talking about is, can we even sit and listen to each other? Can we listen respectfully and put ourselves in the shoes of those who disagree with us? And can we even imagine that someone could have this different opinion and we could still respect that? And I think that's something that a number of groups who are out there, so-called bridging groups, are out there trying to get people just to sit over a cup of coffee or over a beer, have a conversation, and understand that somebody's coming from a different place, but that doesn't make them evil. It doesn't make them a bad or dishonest or terrible person. And yet, right now, most Republicans say they think most Democrats are dishonest and vice versa, immoral. And that's really sad, in my opinion, but that's where we are. And we've got a lot of work to do just to get to a place where we stop and are willing to entertain the idea that somebody could disagree with us politically, but that doesn't make them a terrible person.
Mm-hmm. Judy, thank you for talking to all those voters and keeping that up. Ryan, Judy talked about lots of individuals and stories and what she heard. You're a professor, you were a pastor, you're a dad, but you're a numbers guy. You're probably the best numbers guy that we have. What do the exit polls and your analysis tell us about the choices of religious voters, specifically Catholics and the different kinds of Catholics, white, Latino, African American? And then I'm going to ask you about other religious communities and how all this compares to the last two times Trump ran. But what does the data tell us about what happened?
Yeah, so the God gap's a huge deal. It's really the white God gap. It's if you're a white person and religious, you're almost certainly a Republican now. It used to be in America, we have, in the Christian tradition, we divide us up into evangelical Protestants, mainline Protestants, black Protestants, and Catholics. So those are sort of the way we understand Christian religion. And evangelicals are 80% Republicans. We know that. But there was this group in America called the mainline, which is Episcopalians, United Methodist, United Church of Christ. And they used to be, the largest group in America were mainline Protestants. 50% of all American adults were mainline Protestants in the 1950s. And they were this great tradition where you had Democrats and Republicans sitting side by side on Sunday morning. And they've gone from 50% of America to 10% of America. And they're going to be 5% of America very soon because the average mainline Protestant in America is about 60 years old. So what you're going to have in the white church is you're going to have a whole lot of evangelicals who are incredibly Republican, incredibly conservative. 80% of them are going to vote for whoever the Republican is. And the main line used to be 50-50, and they're going to be basically gone in most parts of America. So if you're white and religious, you almost have to be Republican by default. And I think some of that is leaking into the Catholic Church. Because, you know, we look back at the Kennedy coalition, right? It was a lot of white Catholics voted for Kennedy. 2/3 of white Catholics identified as Democrats in 1972. And now 60% of white Catholics voted for Donald Trump in 2024, which is up about 5 points in the last two election cycles. And what we also know is that Catholics that go to Mass more are more Republicans, white Catholics. The Hispanic Catholic vote is a really interesting vote, though, that we don't really understand quite yet because the exit polls are not super reliable on this, but it looks like what happened. And you can see this in places like Miami-Dade County. Hillary Clinton won it by 30 points and Trump won it by 13. Think about that. In an 8-year stretch, we saw almost a complete flip. And that's a heavily Hispanic county. There's a county in the Rio Grande Valley in southern Texas called Starr County that used to be 70% Democrats, and Donald Trump won it in 2024. We're seeing Hispanics move significantly to the right. And I think part of that is the Democratic Party has sort of taken them for granted on cultural issues, on faith issues. I think a lot of them voted for Democrats and sat on their hand when it came to things like abortion and same-sex marriage. But I think the Harris campaign, by leaning so hard into we're going to bring Roe versus Wade back, you know, and not talking about carve-outs for religious institutions and not even really talking about religious institutions in any meaningful way, kind of pushed a lot of Hispanic Catholics away from the Democratic Party when they would have voted for them. I think it was the economy pushed them a lot, and Harris didn't do a whole lot to kind of cater to that group, and they've left, and they might not be back.
What about other important religious groups? Fascinating things going on in the Muslim community, the Jewish community, Black Protestant community, and as you said, Latino evangelicals and Latino Catholics. What do the numbers show us?
So if we look at non-religious voters, we really got to break them up into three categories. Okay, there's atheists, there's agnostics, and there's a group we call nothing in particular. And that's literally what they check on the survey. The last option is like none of the above. I don't want any of that stuff. So if you put 5 non-religious people in a room, one's an atheist, one's an agnostic, and 3 are nothing in particular. So most nones are nothing in particular, and they're a really malleable group. For instance, 55% voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, but then Biden got 64% of that group in 2020. I think that that Harris did a lot worse with that group in 2024. They went back to Donald Trump because they're the ones who are hurt by high inflation and a bad economy. Atheists are incredibly liberal. 90% of them voted for Harris, probably 85% of agnostics. But the Democrats have this huge problem. Their coalition is this weird mishmash of atheists, but also Black Protestants, also Hispanic Catholics, also Muslims. So how do you appeal to all those groups at one time? It's pretty easy to be a Republican right now. Christianity's good. White people are good. White Christianity's good. 80% of your coalition done. Democrats can't do that, and that's become a problem for them when it comes to messaging and how to bring in this Big Ten into one coalition.
Can you just say a word about Muslims and Jewish voters?
Yeah. So it looks like the Jewish vote did shift a little bit towards Donald Trump, but we've got to put these groups in context, okay? Somewhere between 6 and 7 million Americans are Jewish, and they're concentrated in certain areas, like New York City, for instance, New Jersey, Florida, places like that. So they probably don't make in terms of swinging states, they don't make a whole lot of difference. I'm really interested to see the Muslim vote in Michigan. I mean, that was a close state in 2020. There aren't a ton of Muslims in Michigan, only 2% of the population. But when elections are within 100,000 votes of each other, that can make a huge difference. Exit polls say that 30% of Muslims voted for Trump in 2024. If that's true, that would be it was 5% of Muslims voted for Trump in 2020. So if he makes 25-point gain there, that's a lot.
Thank you for those numbers. Tom, you're a Jesuit, a journalist, and a political scientist. You're also a respected commentator who is very candid in your assessment of what's going on in the Catholic community. What's your take on what happened? What do you think was going on? We've heard the numbers. What do you think are the forces that led to more white Catholics supporting Trump? 5 points more, Ryan said, and more Latino Catholics supporting Trump. What do you think's going on in our community?
I think the distinctiveness of the Catholic vote is just getting less and less. I mean, white Catholics are like other white folks. Hispanics, Catholics are becoming more like other Hispanics. So I think we are part of the American mass melting pot now. We still make a significant impact because of numbers. And we tend to go with the winner. If Catholics vote for a candidate, it's almost always the candidate that wins. So I think that's going on. There's some other things that are unique in the Catholic context that I think are worth noting. Principle of which is that although we Catholic, especially progressive Catholics, like to give the bishops a bad time, the bishops don't endorse candidates, nor do they endorse political parties. Unlike the white evangelicals and the black evangelicals, who do endorse candidates and political parties. So I think that's one good thing we can say about the role of Catholics in politics, is that the church leaders, although they kind of signal their feelings, and some of them do come out of the closet, for the most part, they stay silent. And I think that's a positive thing that I think other ecclesial religious leaders could learn from.
Yeah, you talked about the bishops not endorsing. There were a bunch of Catholics who did endorse. There was Catholics for Trump, Catholics for Harris, Catholic vote. How do you think those efforts impact? You had Trump with Ave Maria as part of the set list for the thing. One of the great moments. Raymond Arroyo asked Trump if Ave Maria and some of the images he were using was part of his spiritual journey. He said, "No, I think it's really pretty," you know. But the Harris campaign didn't seem to make that great an effort. What do you think? All these other things that were trying to move Catholics, did they have much impact?
I don't think they really had much impact. Certainly, the progressive groups that tried to push Catholics towards Harris failed utterly. The Catholic groups for Trump, I think, just reinforced where white Catholics were going in any case, and where where Hispanic Catholics were tending because of other reasons, the economy. I mean, what's remarkable is, despite everything the bishops have tried to do to make abortion the Catholic issue, the public opinion polls show that Catholics are pretty much the same as everybody else in this country on abortion. They haven't moved the needle at all. So I don't see that has had a big impact.
One last quick question. It feels like the most prominent Catholic in public life has moved from President Biden to Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. They're very different kinds of Catholics. What do you think that means?
Well, the bishops don't have Biden to kick around anymore. The ones who wanted to deny him communion and get a headline that way, that's gone. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with the vice president, because now he, along with Trump, is pro-choice. He, along with Trump, is in favor of in vitro fertilization techniques and things. And even Trump wants to fund these for people. This is totally against where the bishops are coming from. So are they going to take Vance to the woodshed on this? We'll have to wait and see.
Sabrina, we're going to move from Catholics to the rest of the world. You have been doing on-the-ground reporting for the Post. Before that, you did it for Politico. You spent a lot of time in battleground states. Much of the early coverage is focused on Latinos, some of the shifts we talked about. You've been covering this for a while. I saw a tweet, I don't know if it was today or yesterday, that with Marco Rubio becoming Secretary of State, you reminded us that in many ways he was Secretary of State for Latin America in the first Trump term. So you've been covering this a long time. What does your reporting tell you about what was going on in the Latino community? Not just the numbers, but the values, the forces that were pushing people. And then I'm going to ask you about different kinds of Latinos, religiously, ethnically, economically. Some people have been here a long time, other people just arrived. And then my final question is going to be, what do you think this talk of mass deportation was going to do to the Black community? So the first thing is, what do you think happened and what do you think drove it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, John, the reality is that this was not a surprise. This has been coming. I think the number seemed alarming when people saw the exit polls for Democrats looking and seeing that, oh, it was only, 56% of Latinos who voted for Harris when they expected it to be higher. I think shocked a lot of people, and just seeing the punditry over the last week around it. There's a lot of pointing fingers and blame game being launched right now, but it's not surprising for someone who's been paying attention to Latino voters. I mean, we saw already that Trump had made inroads with Latinos after the 2020 election. And at the time, a lot of Democrats wrote it off as a product of, oh, this is just a Miami thing. This is just a South Texas thing. Oh, it's Cubans. And I know we're going to get into a little bit more of the distinctions, but it was written off in certain ways. And the erosion in support for Democrats was not a nationwide problem, or it can be, neatly explained in certain places. This election proves that that is not the case, that it's undeniable that this happened across the country. I think something, of course, to be careful with here, though, that I think has been missed in the conversation is Latinos were part of why Donald Trump won the presidency. They are not the reason that Donald Trump won the presidency. And I think that's very important. They were, the 40-something% of Latinos, give or take, because as we get more data in the weeks and months to come, that exact number may shift. But the fact that he did better certainly helped propel him to win. But it's not just the reason. And, we have to look at why across the country people made a shift towards Donald Trump. But I think, just looking at states like Nevada, Arizona, and those are the two that people look at often with Latinos because of just what a big part of the electorate they are. But if you see other battleground states, I mean, if you look at Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, Latinos are a growing part of the electorate there. And they had the same, it ultimately came down to the same question that we saw with the rest of the American public.
Talk about some of the differences in the Latino community. You talked about ethnicity. But what about gender? What about economics? And I'm really interested in how the immigration issue played. Latinos who've been here a long time versus those who are arriving. Who's going to be affected by deportation? How did those differences move within the Latino community?
The most dramatic shift is based off of gender. It's Latino men, no question about it. It's about a 19-point swing toward Donald Trump that we saw. And part of that is based off of the campaign that we saw, Donald Trump launch. I mean, he focused very much on men in his campaign. And I think, I have a story coming out this week, so I'm getting ahead of myself. But I think someone who has really great answers for this is Ruben Gallego, who was just elected senator of Arizona. And he won. He is a Democrat. He won in Arizona, the same state that Donald Trump won. So that means thousands of people split their tickets in Arizona to vote for him. And in a conversation with him, he was saying that, for Latino men, there will be pundits talking about that this has to do with racism and sexism within the Latino community, and specifically, among Latino men, but that really there's this idea that, like Latinos men growing up have this idea that they need to be the protector, the provider for their family, and that these past 4 years have been really tough for Latino men, whether it's looking at the prices going up or growing resentment, seeing migrants coming across the border and not feeling like it was really being addressed by the Biden administration. So all of that really put together, ultimately led to the results and led to more Latino men looking to Donald Trump in this election. And that's just one aspect of the community, like I mentioned, the gender. But I think something else that was striking was one of the expectations here was that Donald Trump's rhetoric around immigration, his focus on, denigrating more recently arrived migrants was going to have an impact on Latino voters. And I think right before the election, one of the most striking data points was New York Times CNN. They did a poll specifically focused on Latino voters. And with that, we saw a majority of Latinos in the United States don't think that Donald Trump is talking about them when he talks about immigration. And it was something like 62% of Latinos born in the US didn't feel like they identified with it. And half of Latinos that were born abroad, immigrants, also did not think that Donald Trump was talking about them. So he really played on a distinction. He really was able to play on, some of the differences between Latinos and some of the nuances and tensions that within our community we grapple with on a daily basis.
And we're about to find out who he's talking about, which will be a big challenge for the country, but also for the church. Tom, I think you have a question for Sabrina.
Yeah, Sabrina, the Democrats for years have been talking about people of color as if Asians, Hispanics, and Blacks all are part of a big voting group. Is that and Ryan can jump in here with the numbers too, is that just a myth, a dream that they had? Because, I mean, my thought was that in a lot of local politics, urban politics, city politics, it's Hispanics versus Blacks fighting over political power. I mean, is this a coalition that's just not going to happen?
I think, Tom, it more and more we're getting evidence that it was a dream. I think just from even just seeing the fallout, and I hate to call it fallout, but the fallout from this election. I mean, looking on social media, I say the last week of looking at social media, looking at some of the punditry on, MSNBC, and there's been a lot of blaming Latino voters, and there's been a lot of focus on, I've seen extremely hateful messages on my social media of saying, well, there will be a whole lot less of you in 4 years, or, it's wait until you're going to get what you deserve for voting for Donald Trump. And there's just been a lot of that going on, which tells me that the coalition that Democrats were dreaming about, this idea that demographics was destiny, this idea that, the more Latinos there are in the United States, they're going to vote like Black voters, and it's going to be this really powerful coalition, is not coming to fruition. I think there's really a conversation that needs to be happening within the Democratic Party about why it is that, again, this group of voters that they thought were going to be reliably Democratic ultimately are breaking with them at this point, are not voting for them in the numbers that they thought. And I think that's important. I think it was based off of some levels of misconception. Latino voters don't have necessarily the same allegiance to the Democratic Party that Black voters do, for instance. So the autopsies that we're going to be getting in the months to come, I think, will be fascinating, but it is a question Democrats need to really grapple with.
We have tons of questions, excuse me. And as I see them, there are several categories. One is about the bishops and their role. One is about race and gender, how it cut in several ways. Another set of questions around the economy. And a final one is, how do we build some connections or some bridges and pursue the common good? Judy, this is delicate talk about, but race and gender are big deal in the United States. We have a long history with both. And it seems like there's sort of two ways people talk about this. Harris lost because she was a Black woman. And another piece of that is people who didn't support her were accused of being racist or sexist. You have not been a part of those ideological fights. You have been talking to real voters. how do you think really complicated, important moral issues of racism, sexism, and how we treat each other played out in this election?
Well, I don't think we fully understand it yet, John. I think we again we need to continue to dig through these numbers that we have from exit polls, but mainly these answers are going to come from talking with voters themselves, because you can't really ask an exit poll, did you vote against Kamala Harris because she's Black and Asian? Did you vote against her because she's a woman? People don't acknowledge that. I mean, and clearly people who are for Donald Trump will say they are not racist, that this was not a race-based decision. They may say they're not comfortable with a woman, we talked about that a moment ago, having the highest position in the world, and even women. There are some women who have that view as well. But when it comes to race, we know that this is woven through our history as Americans. We've dealt with it in many ways badly. We've made a lot of progress, but we still have a long way to go. It was just 4 years ago that George Floyd was murdered. And so, and then there was a backlash to the reaction to that, which I think to this day, still, had some resonance in the way people voted, or in the way they described their preferences in this election. So it is complicated. It's clearly a factor. The question is how much of one. But I think it's one that we have to talk openly about. I think we shouldn't be sweeping it under the rug. We should be saying, okay, so all these people who voted for Donald Trump they are emphatically saying I'm not racist. But there did appear to be some element of racism in the opposition to Kamala Harris. How do we tease that out? What is it? What is it about Americans and the fear of immigrants, the fear of the other? It all goes back to what your question earlier to me, John, about what's at the source of our division. It's a lot of things. It's where we grew up. It's the family influence on us. It's the neighborhood we live in. Do we live near people who look different from us? How open are we based on our faith, based on our education? How open are we to new ideas, new people? There are just so many different threads to this. But I think it's important that we talk about it, that we talk about the role of race in America. It is not as if it's just gone and done with, that it's behind us and we've moved on. We'd like to think that, but that's clearly not the case.
Yeah. Ryan, I think you pointed out Donald Trump broadened enormously his coalition, involving people more women, more Latinos, more Blacks than before. Is part of the problem, as Judy said, racism is ingrained in all this. But on the other hand, accusing people who make a political choice of racism and sexism when they may have a different view of the world is probably not a good way to persuade them.
I think I just finished a book manuscript, and I have two I don't like to be prescriptive. I like to be descriptive, right? I don't like to tell people what to do, but one thing I'll say is we've got to do two things. One is we've got to call extreme views, so people know they're extreme views. Social media has this weird way of elevating very fringe beliefs, and it almost makes you think they're mainstream. Like the idea that abortion is murder and women should be jailed for abortion. That position's held by 6% of Americans. Like, let's be clear about that's an extreme position. But my other prescription is we got to stop calling people names. We got to stop dehumanizing other people. Like, if you vote for Harris, you're not a baby killer. And if you vote for Trump, you're not a racist. Okay, like that is not a helpful way to engage in dialogue. And what people who study genocide, not saying we're gonna have a genocide in America, but one of the steps to genocide is using dehumanizing language against the other side. In Rwanda, their radio broadcast before the genocide, they were calling each other vermin and snakes. And it's a lot easier to kill a snake than it is a human being. And I think if people of faith, like myself, I believe in Imago Dei. Every human being is born in the image and likeness of God, whether they vote for someone I like or someone I don't like. That does not make them racist. It does not make them a baby killer. It gives them a different opinion than I have. Unfortunately, we are not interacting with people who are different than us in the neighborhood, in the employment, in the church. And that's even worse, by the way. The church used to be a great meeting place of left, right, and center, rich and poor, men and women all came together under the same roof. And now the data says overwhelmingly the church has become one thing, which is educated people who make decent incomes, married with children. And that leaves out a huge swath of America that's being left behind by our economy and our society. And the church could and should work to bridge these divides, not make them worse.
It's worth, in the interest of accuracy, to point out that it was Donald Trump who called immigrants vermin. And the demonization of our sisters and brothers, the ridicule of another candidate as low IQ seems to be a little bit of a dog whistle. In some cases, there might be implicit condescension in that, but in other cases, it's really explicit. I mean, there are women who think a sexual predator was elected president, and how is that possible? So we all got to understand each other better, not judge each other, but some things are there and need to be addressed. Let me ask Sabrina, I was really struck in a thing I saw. Somebody did a story. They said it really wasn't the economy, it was all this other stuff. And you said, I think it was on Twitter, I talked to hundreds of voters. They knew exactly what the price of bread was, the price of eggs, all that the economy, a lot of people were left behind. So how do you put together the fact that you had a candidate and a campaign that was demonizing people, yet you had people who saying, I'm not for that, but I am really worried about standing in a food line in Steubenville. How does that play out in a country like ours?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the conversation the last week has been like debating how important actually the economy was, or was it the economy? Was it really the economy, or was it perceptions of economy? And that tweet that I sent out was, having conversations with voters. It is reality that prices went up, and it is reality for many people that their rent went up and that their rent did not go up, that maybe their wages did go up in the last 4 years, but that their rent went up higher and that they cannot afford to live the way that they lived 4 years ago. And I some of the engagement on that tweet was funny because people were like, well, did you look at their grocery receipts? Like, did you actually confirm some of these things? And I'm not kidding you, John. I went into some of the local grocery stores sometimes because I was like, did steak really go? Is steak now really $18 a pound? And actually went to look and get a sense of that reality. But I think for some people, and again, to what I originally said of the multitudes, and I'll tie it in with immigration here, was a lot of people pick and choose what they believe a candidate is actually going to do. And a lot of the conversation around, Donald Trump, his policies, I mean, he focused so heavily in the campaign on immigration. He promised that he is going to execute the largest mass deportation operation in U.S. history. I mean, at his rallies across the country, that line was the one that would draw the loudest by far applauses in the crowd. That is something that a lot of Donald Trump's biggest supporters, the people who go to a rally in the middle of a day on a weekday, that is the kind of promise that a lot of people really wanted to see him execute, and really want to see him focus on day one. And we're seeing all the efforts that are underway right now to actually make that happen. But I think that only tells a piece of the story. A lot of people who voted for Donald Trump, who I met out and about, not at a Trump rally, would talk about mass deportation in different terms. They might tell you, if you just ask them yes or no, do you support mass deportation? They'd say yes. But then when you'd actually get into a conversation with them, well, no, they actually mean that they want to see deportation of criminals, or, oh, no, they just want to see deportation of people who are taking advantage of the system, or people who just arrived here in the last few years. No, they don't want to see, their neighbor who's been in the US for decades be deported. And I think that showed us sort of the nuances around this, where a lot of people, we're going to be having a conversation 6 months from now and looking at what the execution of certain Trump policies looked like and how people who voted for him actually think it's going.
Well, it's really going to be a test. It's going to be a test for the church, a test for the country, a test for us. If he's going to deport millions of our sisters and brothers, this is no longer a matter of theory or, he didn't mean me. This, for people who believe that all our sisters and brothers are made in the image and likeness of God, splitting up families to do this is going to test all of us. It's also going to test the bishops. My final question for you, Tom, is a lot of questions about the bishops, about the preeminent concern for abortion, about the role they played and the role they should play. What would your advice be for the bishops in the aftermath of this election?
Shut up.
Well, thanks for that, Tom.
No,
can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think progressive Catholics love to beat up on the bishops. I beat up on the bishops all the time. But I think we can overemphasize their role. I don't think the bishops can deliver their mothers a vote, let alone the vote of the people in their dioceses. The credibility of bishops is so low these days that I don't think anybody's following them. The people that already hold the same positions are cheering them on and supporting them, but their ability to deliver, change people's minds or deliver votes that way, I just don't think it's there anymore. I mean, in the good old days when the Democratic Party was made up of white men who were not college educated, working class folks, it was just a different world. And we have not seen such a change in American politics as we saw caused by Trump, where the white working class, non-college educated men are now part of the Trump Republican coalition. I mean, this is revolutionary. We haven't had a change in political party alignment like this since the white Southerners left the party after Johnson enacted the Civil Rights Movement. So, I mean, these are big changes that are happening in American politics.
I rarely disagree with Tom. He knows a lot more than I do about a lot of things. But I, for one, hope the bishops will speak up on mass deportation, will speak up on any example of racist policy, will speak up for the child tax credit that they say they're for.
Well, John, I mean, let me just interrupt.
Let me finish my point.
Sure.
I think the key thing is consistency. If you stand up for the life and dignity of people, you ought to do it when there's a Democrat in the White House and when there's a Republican in the White House, whether it's Joe Biden or whether it's, in fact, Donald Trump. And that'll be a test for them and a test for us.
Let me qualify. When I said shut up, I meant in terms of elections.
No.
But in terms of the issues you're talking about, absolutely. And the bishops have been speaking out. I did a study of their press releases during the Trump administration. They were vocal. They used extreme language in criticizing Trump on immigration, on healthcare, and lots of other things. But, frankly, it's partially the bishop's fault for not pushing that in any way but press releases, and partially due to the fact that the media doesn't care what the bishops say except when they talk about sex.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to end on that. As somebody who tried to help them talk about a lot of other stuff, they played a major role in passing family and medical leave. They played a major role in passing the child tax credit. And this will be a test for them and a test for us. For the initiative, challenging times send us back to mission. And our mission is to share our deep conviction that the principles of Catholic social teaching, human dignity, solidarity, lifting up the poor, care for creation, that's the best way forward for our country, for our church. We believe in dialogue, having people of different views. There are folks online who are furious at us for not taking on this or taking on that, but we have diverse points of view. And we are really working to have a new generation of leaders that is more diverse, younger, frankly, more female, more Latino, more African American. And we think what happened on Tuesday makes that mission more important than ever. And one of the things we do is get really smart people together to talk about what happened. And that's what we did tonight. I am so grateful to Judy and to Ryan and to Tom and Sabrina for what you've shared with us, the candor, the facts. I want to call attention to a couple upcoming dialogues. It's not an initiative event without a commercial. Next Monday, we're having a really timely and fascinating discussion about peacemaking, the biblical call to peacemaking, looking at Ukraine, the Middle East, South Sudan, and with an amazing group of people, Father David Hollenbach, Jordan Denari Duffner, Sister Mumbi Kugutha, I hope I got that right, and from South Sudan, and Tetiana Stanichi from Ukraine. That's next Monday in Dahlgren Chapel. And as I mentioned, on December 10th at Georgetown, join us in person. We're going to talk about what do we do now. And we have the president of Holy Cross, Vince Rougeau, the president of Catholic Charities USA, Carrie Robinson, the Sister Maya, Teresa Maya, who's now at Catholic Health Association, and David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, Judy Woodruff's colleague on the NewsHour for many years, to talk about what are the Catholic responsibilities and opportunities. Visit our website for more details. I want to thank our director, Kim Daniels, and our colleagues, Kim Mazik, Anna Gordon, and Christian Sonnen, for all their help. And finally, we can't really clap. It doesn't make enough noise. But we really want to thank Ryan, Tom, Sabrina, and Judy for being a part of this informative, thoughtful, and substantive conversation. And we hope to see you at our next dialogue. Thank you very much.